There are moments that exist outside the frame, outside the rehearsed answer, the studio lighting, the version of yourself you've spent years learning how to present. Moments that happen in the margins of a very public life, in a corridor, in a quiet aside, in the unguarded space between what someone shows the world and what they actually carry, when no one with a camera is officially paying attention. Most of those moments evaporate. They dissolve back into the private lives they came from, unseen, unremarked upon. Lost before anyone had a chance to notice them, this one didn't disappear. When footage emerged showing Savannah Guthrie and her mother together in what many who watched it described as a deeply unexpected exchange, the initial reaction wasn't outrage. It wasn't the kind of loud, immediate internet storm that tends to erupt around public figures when something controversial surfaces. It was something far quieter than that, and in some ways, far more difficult to dismiss. It was the specific, collective pause of people watching something play out on a screen and feeling, with a certainty they couldn't quite put words to, that what they were seeing was genuinely real, not performed, not shaped for consumption, real in the way that almost nothing involving someone at Savannah Guthrie's level of public life ever manages to be. No filter had touched it. No preparation had preceded it. No version of the moment had been reviewed, approved, or softened before it reached anyone's eyes. Just two people, a mother and a daughter, and something moving between. Then that the camera caught before either of them had a chance to stop it. The clip traveled the way only certain things travel online, not because it was explosive or scandalous in the conventional sense, but because it was specific. Because people who watched it found something in it that they recognized, something familiar in a way that was also uncomfortable, something that made them want to return to it, not for entertainment, not for the thrill of watching a public figure in an unguarded moment, but because one viewing hadn't been enough to fully absorb what they had just seen. That impulse, that quiet, persistent need to look again more carefully is where this story begins. Savannah Guthrie has spent the better part of 2 decades constructing one of the most recognizable and trusted presences in American morning television. That kind of trust is not handed to anyone. It is built slowly and deliberately, through repetition and consistency, and the particular intimacy that develops when someone enters your home through a screen, morning after morning, for years. When someone becomes part of the rhythm of how your day begins. When their face becomes as familiar as the faces of people you actually know. She earned that place through a career that started long before the anchor desk and the live interviews and the name recognition that comes with occupying a seat at the center of American broadcast journalism. She came up through the work, through reporting, through courtrooms, through the demanding, unglamorous process of learning how to find a story and tell it clearly under pressure. By the time her name became something that most people in this country recognized, she had already spent years developing something that no amount of television exposure can manufacture on its own: genuine journalistic instinct and the discipline to use it. The version of herself she brings to that desk is warm, composed, capable of real vulnerability, but always in measured, carefully considered doses, enough to feel human, never enough to feel uncontrolled. She has spoken, over the years, about her faith, about her family, about the unexpected experience of becoming a mother later in life than she had planned for. These glimpses into her personal world have always felt genuine, which is exactly what makes them effective. They are not manufactured, but they are managed. There's a version of Savannah Guthrie that the public has been invited into, and there is everything else, which has remained, deliberately and successfully, private. Her mother, Nancy Guthrie, has existed almost entirely within that private space. She is not a public figure. She has not sought visibility of her own, and she has not been sought out by the broader conversation surrounding her daughter's career. What most people who follow Savannah's work know about her mother could be contained in a few lines, drawn from the occasional warm reference, the brief affectionate mention, the kind of soft, loving framing that suggests a close and grounded family foundation, without inviting any real scrutiny of what that foundation actually contains. That picture, steady, warm, uncomplicated, is part of what gave the footage its particular force. Because what people saw when the clip began to circulate was not the relationship they had been given reason to imagine. It was not the easy, comfortable dynamic that years of carefully framed public narrative had suggested. What they saw was something with more texture to it, more weight. Two women whose shared history was visible in every frame, and who were, in that particular moment, carrying something that neither of them appeared to have set down, something that hadn't been resolved, something the camera had no business catching, and caught anyway. The questions that followed didn't arrive loudly. They gathered quietly, the way certain kinds of questions do, building beneath the surface of the initial reaction, accumulating weight before most people even noticed they were forming. To understand why those questions carried the force they did, it helps to understand the kind of public narrative that had existed before the footage appeared. Public figures and their families inhabit a strange double reality. There's the version constructed for visibility, the references, the appearances, the carefully chosen details that shape how the outside world understands a relationship. And then there is the actual lived experience of that relationship, which is private, complex, and entirely beyond what any observer can claim to access with certainty. For Savannah Guthrie, the family narrative offered to the public had always carried a particular quality of stability. She has spoken over the years about the values her upbringing gave her, about faith as something that grounds her, about a kind of grounded, Midwestern solidity that she has credited, in various settings, with keeping her anchored through the very specific pressures of living a highly visible professional life. Her mother has appeared in that narrative not as a character with her own complexity, but as a presence, steady, loving, foundational, the kind of parental figure who shaped who someone became, without ever needing to step into the story themselves. That framing is not unusual. It is, in fact, how most public figures handle the parents who shaped them, but did not choose public life for themselves. They become background, architecture, important to the structure of the person, but not part of what gets examined. The architecture, for a long time, gave every appearance of being sound. Nothing had publicly cracked. Nothing had surfaced to suggest that what was being projected outward didn't reflect what existed privately, which is exactly what made the footage land the way it did. It arrived without explanation, without context, without anyone to provide the framework that would have allowed viewers to understand immediately what they were seeing and why. It was simply there, a brief, unguarded moment between two people, and people began watching it with the kind of careful, searching attention that only genuinely unmanaged footage tends to attract. What pulled people in wasn't confrontation. There were no raised voices, no visible break, no single dramatic moment that announced itself as significant. What pulled people in was subtler, and for that reason, harder to dismiss. It was the energy that exists between two people who have known each other completely and for a very long time, the quality of a relationship where almost nothing needs to be stated directly because almost everything is already understood. That quality, unmistakable once you recognize it, was present in every frame, and what it seemed to be communicating, beneath the visible surface of the exchange, was not light. It carried weight, the specific, quiet weight of something that had been present between these two people for a long time and had not yet found its resolution. Footage that spreads the way this clip did rarely does so because of one shocking thing. More often, it moves because of something more elusive, a quality of truth that viewers recognize before they can articulate why. The clip circulated because people who saw it felt something specific, and that feeling was consistent across viewers who had no connection to each other and were watching in entirely different circumstances. The words that appeared in early reactions clustered around similar territory: uncomfortable, tense, the recurring description of feeling like a witness to something private, not because anything inappropriate was on display, but because the intimacy of the exchange felt genuine in a way that public footage almost never does. Several people described a sensation of having seen something they weren't supposed to see, not in a voyeuristic sense, but in the sense that the moment clearly belonged to these two women and had not been intended for anyone else. The first thing careful viewers pointed toward was the body language, not the broad, declarative kind, not gestures that announce meaning, The smaller kind. The kind that speaks without intending to. The angle of a shoulder held in a particular way. The quality of eye contact made or withheld at a specific moment. The weight of a silence that was doing far more work than any words spoken around it. According to those who reviewed the footage closely, what the interaction appeared to reflect was tension of a very specific and recognizable kind. Not the tension between strangers, not the tension created by external pressure, but the tension that lives inside a relationship, the kind that comes from shared history, from accumulated expectation, from things spoken and unspoken over the course of a lifetime together. That distinction carries significance, because tension sourced from within a relationship reads differently than tension that arrives from outside it. It is quieter, more restrained, and it tends to be, precisely because of those qualities, more revealing of something real, the questions that began forming around what specifically might have preceded the moment, what conversation or circumstance had placed these two women in front of a camera neither appeared to be managing, were questions the footage itself could not answer. What preceded the moment? What had brought them there together? What, if anything, did the exchange reflect about a relationship that years of public narrative had consistently framed as simply warm and uncomplicated? No official statement appeared to provide context. No explanation followed the clip into circulation. The absence of framing became, for many people watching, the most significant element of all. There's a kind of silence that belongs specifically to people who have spent a lifetime together. It is not the silence of distance or indifference. It is a silence with content, dense with memory, with the history of everything that has ever passed between two people, with all the things that were never fully said and never fully went away. It is the silence that families inhabit, often without naming it, sometimes without ever consciously recognizing it for what it is. That is the silence viewers described sensing in the footage, not necessarily in an absence of words, but in the quality surrounding whatever was being exchanged, in the register beneath the visible surface of the moment. And as more people watched it, the conversation around it deepened and became more serious. What had started as initial surprise and curiosity began developing into something more sustained. People were no longer simply reacting. They were contextualizing, holding what they were seeing against everything they already understood about Savannah Guthrie's public presentation, against the warmth and the discipline and the carefully sustained image, and noticing a gap. Not a gap that declared anything specific, but a gap that asked something. People who study nonverbal communication and interpersonal dynamics have noted, in discussing footage of this general nature, that the exchanges most worth close attention are those containing what some describe as emotional incongruence, moments where the surface expression doesn't align with what the body and the relational energy of an interaction are communicating underneath. According to such observations, these incongruences are rarely performed. They are not conscious choices. They are genuine breaks in the surface, real things pressing through the discipline of a managed exterior because the pressure behind them has built past the point of complete containment. Whether that lens applies to what was visible in this footage and what it would mean if it did are questions the clip raises without the ability to resolve. No conclusion can responsibly be drawn from a moment seen without its full context, without knowledge of what surrounded it, without the ability to ask the people in it what was actually happening. These limits are real and they matter, but the limits of what can be concluded are not identical to the limits of what can be observed. And what was observed consistently across a wide range of people watching independently was specific enough to resist being easily set aside. Something was present in that moment between these two women, something the established public narrative of their relationship had not prepared anyone for, something that the camera, without anyone's permission, made visible. Every family contains rooms that outsiders cannot enter, not necessarily rooms that conceal anything dramatic, but spaces built from shared history, from experience that belongs only to the people who lived it, from the accumulation of everything said and unsaid over the full span of a relationship. These are not rooms that families advertise. They simply exist, known to everyone inside, discussed by no one, maintained through the particular unspoken agreement that holds most family dynamics together. Beneath whatever is shown to the world, the footage seemed, to many who watched it carefully, to point toward one of those rooms. What it contains, what specific weight or unresolved history or emotional complexity it might hold, is not something any outside observer can claim to know. What can be noted is that the moment existed, that it was captured, that it communicated something real, and that what it communicated did not align with the version of this relationship that had been publicly offered over many years. Research into family dynamics in the context of sustained public visibility has suggested, in general terms, that the pressure of living a highly managed public life tends not to simplify the private emotional landscape of those involved. If anything, it intensifies complexity because the discipline required to maintain a consistent public face doesn't dissolve the emotional realities behind it. It compresses them, pushes them inward, and compressed things under sustained pressure tend eventually to find an outlet. An unguarded moment in front of a camera is one of the places that outlet appears. What resonated most deeply with people watching the footage was not the possibility of something scandalous. It was recognition, the recognition of watching two people navigate the layered, complicated reality of a mother-daughter relationship in all its accumulated weight and love and difficulty, in a moment when neither of them had the ability to manage what it looked like. There is something in that which cuts cleanly through the protective insulation of fame and carefully constructed image and lands somewhere entirely human, because almost everyone has stood inside a moment like that. Almost everyone has been in the presence of someone they love deeply and complicated, and felt the full weight of everything between them pressing quietly against the surface of an ordinary exchange. The footage made that experience briefly visible, and visibility of that kind, arriving without warning, tends to stay with people. The conversation around the clip did not follow the usual pattern of how public attention to moments like this typically unfolds. It did not spike and collapse. It did not get replaced by the next thing before most people had fully processed it. It continued, steadily, without drama, with a persistence that suggested it had touched something people were not yet ready to release. The nature of what was being discussed sustained it. This was not a conversation built around accusation or the pursuit of a specific revelation. It was built around observation, around the experience of watching something carefully and allowing the questions it generated to remain open rather than forcing them toward a resolution that the available information couldn't honestly support. Questions have been raised across multiple platforms and in various contexts about the fuller picture of the relationship visible in that footage, about what the history between Savannah Guthrie and her mother might contain, that the public narrative has not reflected, about whether what has been projected, the warmth, the stability, the easy affection of the references, represents the complete truth of something, or represents something more selective, not dishonest in any calculated way, but incomplete in the inevitable way that all public self-presentation is incomplete, because no one offers everything, and no one is required to. No official response has been offered, no context, no statement that would provide the framework that might allow the questions to find somewhere to rest. The silence following the clip's circulation has been complete, and that silence, while it cannot be interpreted with certainty, is itself a kind of presence in this story. What remains, stripped of everything that cannot be known, is this: a moment that felt genuinely unmanaged, a relationship that appeared, inside that moment, more layered and complex than its public representation had led anyone to expect, and a set of questions the footage created, but was never in a position to answer, questions that belong, in the end, entirely to the two women at the center of them. There is something worth holding quietly in the way this whole story unfolded, not the speculation it generated or the questions it raised. Something underneath all,